Hey, Connie, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Your hair looks so fabulous.
Oh my God, thanks. Wow, thank you. I
Is it?
literally, I
It
haven't
looks
got,
darker.
my hair is actually naturally really dark.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, like really dark. I don't even realize sometimes how dark it is. Yeah,
Oh my
but
God, I love it.
I haven't gotten it cut since like Halloween.
Oh my gosh, I have my last haircut was not this December, but the December before, and so I guess it had to have been maybe February. I was like, all right, I ordered like hair cutting scissors and just cut the ends.
Exact same thing. I cut it myself.
I love it. I just wanted to check in and make sure you have everything you need, that you feel confident facilitating, managing all that stuff.
Um, I guess I don't know. Yeah, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Caitlin's coming. Yeah. Oh, there she is. Caitlin, hey.
Sorry, guys.
Don't be sorry. You're not in your walking machine.
I know. I was like, I guess I should be seated for this.
I just wanted to check in because I know Shannon normally takes care of these things. So I just want to check in and make sure you guys are all set and have everything you need. I
appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all good. I think we'll be
great. Okay, great. Perfect. I am still going to be online doing some work. So if you do run into an issue, just message me. I'm actually going to keep the audio on and just listen because I'm curious. But I'm not going to be paying attention to the chat because I'm going to be multitasking and doing work at the same time. So
perfect.
Awesome.
We're all like, I'm a host right now, right?
You should be, because I signed in on my own. So you should be.
Okay.
If you're not, try sharing your screen because that will tell you if you're a host right there.
Yeah, share screen. Yep, I can do it.
Okay, perfect. Connie, and if you make Connie a co-host.
Can I change her though? Connie, can you share your screen? I think she made you a co-host too.
She might have.
Yeah, it looks like I can share my screen.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to mute myself and I'm just going to listen and enjoy. Connie, thank you so much for doing this. And I'll be working. So just ping me an email if you have any issues. Or you could just say, Katie, check the chat. Yes. All right. Awesome.
Thanks, Katie.
So Connie, do you want people to ask questions as you speak, or do you want to leave them till the end?
They can, if they want to type in the chat, there's opportunities where I'll stop and say, does anyone have any questions? So
I'll monitor the chat for you.
Yeah, that'll be good. So I can stop and see if as we go, people want to type them in, and then I can try to do a catch-all. You can do that.
Perfect. Just getting up your bio.
My bio. I went on my phone to do one thing before. I don't remember what it was. Okay.
Seeing if there's any weird things that I need. Concordia University? Is that how you say it?
Yeah. Concordia, yeah. Is Queens in there though?
Yeah, Queens University of Charlotte and from Concordia.
Yeah. In Central Michigan, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I asked because Concordia was just, yeah.
Like an afterthought?
Kind of, yeah. I'm bored. Let me do this kind of thing. So.
What's your new role gonna be? Nominating? Director of nominating?
Yeah.
And so does that happen next year, or is there a director of nominating elect?
Yeah. Zara's director of nominating next year.
You're director of nominating elect.
Yeah, I'm elect.
Hello, everyone. We're going to give it a couple minutes before we jump into tonight's programming. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves here. Connie, we both got out of presenting our Alex budgets tonight.
So what now?
Accident too.
What?
On complete accident too.
I know. We booked this. Don't listen, Pendry. Don't worry. We did very comprehensive pre-training, pre-whatever meetings.
Mm-hmm.
We prepped them. If we both start getting text messages during this, then that's because it's not going well.
And that's a problem.
There's a problem. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are just going to give it a couple more minutes to let everybody's technology settle in here. All right. Yeah, we'll wait till 6:35. If anyone has any council updates that they would like to share while we're here, feel free to go off mute, or any other fun things that's happening in your life.
Yeah, celebrate some successes.
Yeah. I went to D Bar outside in Dorchester. I highly recommend it yesterday.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, they have a good outdoor setup. Like, everything's very far apart, and they have nice, like, powerful heaters. You do get a waitress, which I like. Some places have eliminated the waitress for like just an app, and then you just get like serve busboys kind of, you know.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And it's just I really didn't realize, it's like, you go out to eat, you think like, I go out to eat because of the food and I don't have to cook and I don't have to clean. It's like, yeah, but you also go out to eat because like this woman or man is like navigating your night and pacing everything perfectly. It's like, wow, this is like really important. I know a lot of waiters, so you would think I would like really have understood, but not until it was taken away from me did I think.
Wow. It's an experience. It's a full experience.
It really is.
Full experience.
All right, I'm just gonna give it one more minute, everybody.
Has anyone been outside today? I have not. Well, I was outside this morning, actually, at like 8 a.m. But is it nice out? Looks nice out. Is it nice out?
Chilly, but it is nice. It's kind of gone through like everything.
Well, it's very New England, right?
It is. All right, ladies. Oh, good. See, yeah, Kate said it's beautiful out. Oh, leftover Easter candy. That is a good idea. That was smart.
Nice. Smart. Very smart.
I feel like because people aren't going into the stores, there's even more. Like, I saw so much leftover Valentine's Day candy. It was crazy.
Crazy. I think there's still leftover Valentine's Day candy at my house.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to do a couple just league announcements to start us out here. We've got some great trainings and social events on the calendar. Next week for trainings, we have a night with Women's Lunch Place. For those of you that don't know, Women's Lunch Place is right next to us. They're our neighbor on Newbury Street when we all were at headquarters. And so it's a great way to learn about what they do. It's going to be a great night. And then on Tuesday, we have Pendry, who is here tonight with us, talking about how the league's finances influence our impact. And if you just got your dues email and you're like, where does all this money go? This is the perfect training for you. And I highly recommend, letting your other league friends know about it, because it's really eye-opening. We did this training in the fall and I learned so much, and I've been in the league for a long time. So even if you're been in the league for a long time, if you're not just new, it's a really good one. Highly recommend that.
I promise I will try not to make it as boring as it sounds.
It was very entertaining and fun, actually, I have to say. It's not a boring training.
Not boring at all.
I just try and keep myself entertained.
Exactly.
It works.
Thank you.
And then we have creating a standout resume, which even if you are not looking to revamp your resume, we might be doing something in the future with community projects where you could help other people revamp their resume. So I think it's just a good overall general skill. And then speaking of overall great general skills, we have grant writing 101 the following week. We have food is medicine, a night with FEMA. I don't even know if you say it, FIMMA. I'm not totally sure how people say it. So if someone knows, just feel free to chime in. But that's one of our advocacy initiatives is food insecurity. That week, there's a candle pouring, which are very popular social events. So highly recommend checking that out as well. There are other fun social stuff on the calendar. And then into May, we have more events, more trainings. We have overcoming perfectionism in leadership and beyond, which I think is great if you are struggling with that, which I think all of us are. And in a time of COVID, you really have to let it go sometimes. So this will be a good lesson for everyone that joins in. And gala tickets are on sale. Gala is May 22nd, open to members and the public. So Katie Hatch just put that in. It's going to be great. It's going to be fun. Check it out. I will be there. So I'll see you there. But moving on, if anyone has any other council updates, feel free to go off mute, throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we will head on into tonight's program. I'm so excited to have my very dear friend and fellow league member, Connie Henderson, here tonight. Connie has been a public school teacher in Cambridge since 2015. She received her BS in education from Central Michigan University and her Master's of Education from Queen's University of Charlotte and from Concordia University. Connie holds both a high school 8 through 12 and middle school 6 through 8 ELA teaching license in the state of Massachusetts. She is currently our very own Vice President of Membership and will be serving as Director of Nominating Elect next year. So very excited and proud of her. Prior to that, in the league, she was the transfer program manager. So I will, at that, put a plug in for leadership. If any of you guys are interested in leadership, feel free to reach out to Connie, myself, Pendry, anyone else on this call wants to put their name in for anyone that has questions. You can always email us and ask any questions you might have. But side note, back to Connie, super excited to have you tonight, and I will pass the floor to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. That was quite a bio. Like, I guess I've never really thought of my bio before.
We're very impressed and excited to have you.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Like, yeah, thanks. All right. Oops, let me do the share my screen process. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm sorry, I don't actually use Zoom at work, so can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for that introduction, Caitlin. I'm glad that you could be with me tonight and to get some information about standardized testing, who it's helping, who it's hurting, and who is left behind. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Like Caitlin said, I'm a middle school English language arts teacher. I taught for 5 years in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then the last 6 years I've been in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I went ahead and put my beautiful school picture up there. They get better as you get to be an adult. So great. As we go through, if you have any questions about anything, any clarifying questions or anything that you want me to expand upon or go over again, feel free to type them in the chat. I will stop at, there's a couple of points in the presentation that I'll stop and answer questions, but also if you wanted to wait until the end, I'll take questions at the end as well. So either way, whatever works for you, works for me. Okay, so first I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to start out that way. What do you know about standardized testing? Feel free to unmute, type in the chat. What do you know about standardized testing? What comes to mind when you hear standardized testing? Anything at all?
Fear.
Fear, okay. You hated them as a kid. Yes, it does have to do with school funding. Sure, anyone else? No Child Left Behind. Anything else? Standardized testing, what pops into your head? Ooh, bubbles and number 2 pencils. That's a good one. All right, so some of you touched on a couple of things that we will actually talk about in this presentation as well. But in order to kind of get to where we are today with standardized testing, we have to, go back to the beginning. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This is kind of what started it all. This was part of President Johnson's War on Poverty campaign, right? And the goal was to provide educational equity. And I just want to name and go back over like equity versus equality. Quality is when everyone gets the same. So if you look at that top row, every single person has the exact same bike, and it doesn't work for everyone, right? Where equity is when people get what they need. And so when you see the people that are riding bikes that fit more of what they need, right? Then we have equity, which can end up bringing us up to equality, right? As somebody mentioned, with funding, property taxes fund public schools, right? And so what the government was finding was that affluent communities that have higher property taxes have better funded schools. So the ESEA, what it did was it tried to make things more equitable, right? By providing federal funds to districts that were in need of it. And this is where we get Title I. And Title I, in case you are unclear what that is, it provides financial assistance to local educational programs in schools with high numbers or high percentages of children from low income families, right? So that was that equity piece. That's what Title I is. If you've ever heard of it, it's huge in public education. And that's where the government was trying to bring up those lower income communities to match more affluent communities, right? The government won't give you money for free, shockingly. So Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that's been reauthorized something like 8 times over the years. Probably the most well-known and possibly the most controversial would be No Child Left Behind. Really quickly, that adopted the Common Core, which is a set of standards and skills at each grade level in math and reading and writing. Science and technology came later, and then we also have history and civics that are coming soon, I think. But the idea was that every child should meet grade level standards, right? We don't want to leave any child behind, which then led to high stakes testing, okay? It was reauthorized again in 2015 with Every Student Succeeds Act. And I will be completely honest with you, I actually did not know that until I was putting this presentation together. So it's not very well known, and it's not something that we really talk about a lot in public education, like this reauthorization and these policies. I do want to make note of Race to the Top. This came out in 2009 under the Obama administration. And it wasn't a reauthorization. It's an additional policy, and it's a grants program. So states earned points for certain criteria, leadership, teachers with higher ed degrees, right? And depending on the amount of points that they had, determined how much grant money they received. So I just wanted to bring that up because some people ask about it, and it's sort of like an addition, an add-on to No Child Left Behind. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you another question. What are some ways that you are evaluated in your job? I'm curious, as somebody who doesn't work in the private sector, what are some ways that you are evaluated in your job? How do you know that you're performing well? How do you know that your boss, your manager, quarterly OKRs? I've never heard of that. Anyone else? Are you evaluated? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're not evaluated. I don't know. Tell me. Annual reviews, but they're completely worthless. Okay, that's good to know. Goals you set for performance review. Client service surveys, okay. Anyone else? Okay, so in education, we use standardized testing to evaluate. Objectives that you set with your manager, awesome. So in education, we use standardized testing a lot of times to evaluate both teachers and students, okay? And so what is standardized testing? This is any examination that's administered and scored in a predetermined standard manner, right? So there's two kinds, there's aptitude and achievement. Aptitude are tests that predict how well students are likely to perform in some kind of educational setting. I don't know how a standardized test or a multiple choice test can actually predict that, but that's how they defined it, the SAT, the ACT, right? Standardized achievement tests, this is what we give in K through 12 settings, and it's used to determine whether students are meeting standards, right? And that's what we're going to focus on today. So Dr. Ibram Kendi, he has a quote about standardized tests that I'm going to read, and this is, his words, quote, "To tell the truth about standardized tests is to tell the story of eugenicists who created and popularized these tests in the United States more than a year ago." So just kind of hold on to that. Standardized testing was created or rooted as a tool for eugenicists. So what is eugenics, right? This is the selection of desired heritable characteristics in order to improve future generations, typically in reference to humans. Probably the most well-known example of eugenics would be the Nazis. They used eugenics in order to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups, right? In contemporary usage, the term eugenics is closely associated with scientific racism and white supremacy. So essentially, it was the way that white people were trying to scientifically explain why they were the superior race, okay? And this is showing up in our standardized test. This is what is rooted, created standardized test, okay? So eugenics was the guiding ideology in the first IQ tests that were developed, okay? IQ tests were used in public schools to place kids in classes. Whenever I see this, I kind of think of like in Forrest Gump when he took the IQ test and he was placed, right? And then it went on and on in a different direction. This developed gifted and talented programs, right? And, keep in mind that these tests were designed specifically to benefit white males, okay? They were there to create and to conform a racist belief that the test makers already had, and not to see the full potential of each individual, right? And this plays out with our students still today because they are being measured by norms of white culture in our public schooling, or in our public schools. Right, so Carl Brigham, not the same Brigham from Brigham and Women's Hospital, different guy. But Carl Brigham, he used the Stanford Binet IQ test to develop aptitude tests for the military. He's the father of the SAT. He was an enthusiastic member of the eugenics movement, right? And he worked on this Army Alpha test during the recruitment of World War II soldiers. And they took this test to determine who worked a desk job, who was assigned to the trenches, and it placed soldiers in segregated units and rank as well. And so he considered it really successful. In 1923, he wrote a study of American intelligence. He analyzed the findings of his own test, and he considered it a hugely successful program. And so because it was considered to be successful in the military, it started an expansion of testing in schools. And so by 1925, the US Bureau of Education reported that intelligence and achievement tests were increasingly used to classify students at all levels. And by 1932, million copies of the Stanford Achievement Test are purchased to be used in schools. So that's where we started, like way back 100 years ago, really. So we're going to kind of fast forward now. We're going to skip almost 80 years, basically, of public education history, right? A lot happens in the 20th century regarding education. You have segregated schools, you have busing, you have Brown versus Board of Education, you have charter schools. There were counties and southern schools that refused to integrate, so they closed the public schools, gave tax dollars to white families to send their kids to private schools. It's a mess. We just don't, unfortunately, have time for all of that. So we're going to skip forward to No Child Left Behind, because that's really where we get a lot of the issues that we're faced with today. So this passed in 2002. It increased the federal government's role in holding schools accountable. And there was a special focus on ensuring schools boost the performance of groups of students whose achievements on average are trailed by their peers, right? And these groups are usually what we refer to as English language learners, students in special education, and then poor and minority students. And I want to make a note that when we talk about achievement, what we're talking about here is it's defined by the educational standards set by Common Core. Okay. And so I really just want to reemphasize that the system's already flawed, right? And these results of assessments are really just confirmation bias of racist ideas, right? Of what success means and what success should look like, right? And we'll really talk through a lot of that in this presentation. So you might be thinking, well, yeah, ELL and special education students and minority children, they should be the focus. They should be achieving the same as their peers. And no educator is going to disagree with you with that. However, we do disagree with using a racially biased test that was literally designed to hold them back as the means of evaluation. Okay. So prior to No Child Left Behind, states totally varied in their testing. Michigan, this is where I grew up, we had MEEP. We took the test 3 times in 3rd grade, 6th grade, 9th grade. In Massachusetts, testing didn't start until like 1993 or 1998, depends on who you ask. Right? But when No Child Left Behind was passed, what they said was states must test students in reading and math, grades 3 through 8, and then once again in high school. States did not have to comply with requirements, but if they didn't comply, then they would lose Title I funding. We'll talk about why that's a big deal in a little bit. So they didn't have to comply. They didn't have to test reading and math, grade 3 through 8. But states were required to bring all students to the proficient level by 2014, by the 2013-2014 school year. So you didn't have to do it, but you did have to bring everyone up to proficient 100%. And so they considered this to be what we call the adequate yearly progress. States must make adequate yearly progress, or AYP. Okay. We're gonna spend a little bit of time on AYP because it's really pretty important. The scenarios that we're going to go through here of what could happen if schools do not meet their AYP for 2+ years in a row. So first, schools must allow students to transfer to a better performing school in the district. So if they don't have students meeting their yearly progress, right, then that students from those schools are allowed to go to any school within the district, a better performing school, right? And the issue with that is you could potentially have overcrowding in schools, right? So if you set up a system where what was working and the reasons it was performing well, it becomes difficult to continue to provide that, right? If a teacher is used to having 20 kids in their classroom, and then all of a sudden they might have 30, it's a huge jump, right? It spreads the teacher really thin. It also spreads the resources are really thin, right? I worked in an overcrowded school when I taught in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one year I didn't have enough desks for the number of students that I had in my class, because there literally was not enough desks in the building. So if I asked for a desk, like, hey, I have 2 students that don't have desks, they'd be like, we don't have any. They also, even if we did have any, there also wasn't enough room in the classroom. So physically, if there were desks, physically they would not have been able to even put them in the classroom. So I actually had students sitting on the floor. Yeah, so that's something that overcrowding can happen with overcrowding, right? It's just kind of a Band-Aid, right? If you let them transfer to another school, it's not really fixing anything. The schools could face state intervention. And I know this word intervention, a lot of times people might think like help or support, but not in this context. If a state intervenes, then they're shutting down the schools, which then leads to overcrowding because you have to send those kids somewhere, right? They need education required by law. You can convert to charter schools. If you have questions about charter schools, I'm happy to talk those through at the end and share what I know about them. But charter schools are really kind of a financial drain on our public schools. And then states can take over a school. And this is kind of like a death sentence. There's extreme pressure from the state to literally just do better. Like you have no other choice. You just have to do better. There's no additional funding that teachers or the schools get. They take out old leadership and they put in new leadership. You get a new principal, new assistant principal. They ask you to do more testing, right? Because we have to see how students are making progress. So we test. The answer to low test scores is not more testing, it's teaching, right? There are strict rules that are placed on teachers in terms of what they can and cannot and how they can teach. And ultimately it just really takes the joy out of education. Like that's not fun when you go into school and every other week you're taking a test, right? And your teacher is clearly not happy either, right? That doesn't make you happy. So state intervention is not good, right? AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, also provides funding for schools that are meeting their adequate yearly progress. So that means they take away funding from schools that are not meeting AYP and they give money to schools that are meeting AYP. So it just, to me, I'm just sort of like, I need you to make that make sense for me because it doesn't. And one thing that I want to focus on with AYP is that it's solely on meeting standards. It's not about growth, right? AYP was about, it still is, about having 100% of students meet academic standards, AKA the Common Core, right? 100% of students are passing a standardized test by 2014. Growth is about showing improvement and showing your learning, right? If you have a student that scores 30% on a test in 6th grade, and then 40% on the test in 7th grade, first of all, that 10% over 1 year is a huge jump, and we should be throwing a huge party for them. But it doesn't matter because they're still failing, right? And so it's not celebrating what we really want to celebrate, which is learning and growth, right? And getting better. And let's not forget, again, that these tests were created with the purpose of being racially biased. So what has happened is AYP has created what we call high stakes testing. Are there any questions about anything? I feel like I've thrown a lot at you. Any questions? Anything I can clarify? Take a moment. Am I going too fast? Okay. So do you consider yourself a good test taker? I'm curious. I'm not either. I don't consider myself a good test taker. Definitely not. No. Anyone that does consider themselves a good test taker? Most people say no. I was sort of assuming that most people would say no, but does anyone? It depends on the test. It can, sure. If you give me a math test, no way. But if you give me an ELA test or a reading test, maybe, probably. So yeah, maybe it kind of depends. Sure. That's valid. Okay, so I asked you about how you were evaluating. We kind of got all these different answers, right? Goals that don't really matter, right? Your re-evals, right? You sit down and you meet goals and you work towards them and progress and so on and so forth. So in education, our evaluations come from a 30-question multiple choice test, 2 5-paragraph essays that students have 4 hours to complete, right? And imagine if that was you where everyone in your company gets the exact same test, right? Finance, marketing, IT department, human resource, people who work in security, right? People who have worked there for 6 months, who have been there for 6 years, 26 years, right? And your entire performance is based solely on this 30 question multiple choice test. Doesn't matter that you get to work early every day and stay late. It doesn't matter that you met every single deadline, right? It doesn't matter that your client gave rave reviews, right? Public is totally going to judge everything based on these 30 questions that everyone takes and your 2 essays, right? Oh, and you don't get to find out your results for 6 months. So, I don't know. Let's look at some data, MCAS data. MCAS is Massachusetts standardized test. So let's look at some data. What does the data show? So they break it down in 2 parts. You have student race and ethnicity, right? And they break it down African American, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, white, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and then multi-race, non-Hispanic, right? So the particular data that we're gonna look at for Newton Public Schools, they are almost just shy of 60% white. So we would say that it's a predominantly white community, correct? When we look at selected populations, so these are our subgroups that we really, you know, the AYP and our meeting standards and all that really want to target. So the first one is English language learners, excuse me, not English language learners, that's the second one. First language is not English. What that means, these are students who are fluent in English. They can speak, write, and read English at school, but they go home and they'll typically speak a different language with family. Usually they've been in the American public education system since kindergarten. And so they're not learning English, they know English, but they're multilingual, right? They're bilingual, trilingual. Then you have ELLs right below that, English language learners. And these are students, usually they're not born in America, right? They were raised, or they were not raised with English being the dominant language being spoken, right? The higher the grade level, the less ELLs that you have because they usually move here pretty young. Next, you have students with disabilities, and these are students who are in special education. You might hear students on IEPs or individualized education program plan, right? And this is a really wide range. You have students that might have a speech or a language impediment. You might have an autistic student, specific learning disabilities that can impede their education like ADHD, dyslexia. It can include psychological disabilities such as PTSD, depression, severe anxiety. So that's a really wide range when we talk about students with disabilities. Next, we have students with high needs. These are students that are at risk and they need just extra support in education. Students that are living in poverty, who are really far below grade level. If they're at risk of not graduating with a diploma on time, are students who may be experiencing homelessness, maybe they're in the foster care system, right? When you get to the older grade levels, you got to start talking about those that have been possibly incarcerated, right? It also does include students who have disabilities or who are English language learners. And then you have economically disadvantaged, and those are students from, you know, low income households or low socioeconomic status. So when we look at Newton Public Schools data, we can say that it's a white community, right? A high percentage white community. We can also say that for the most part, we would consider them an affluent community because only 10% are economically disadvantaged, right? So when we look at their test scores, when we look at their MCAS scores, this is grade 8 for English language arts. You want to be in the blue and the green. That's exceeding in blue, meaning you're way beyond 8th. Maybe not way beyond, right? But you're beyond. Green, meeting expectations. That means that you are, for this particular example, you are reading and writing at an 8th grade level. Partially is in orange, right? And not meeting is in red. And so the state wants you to be at least in green. It's really great if you're in blue. They don't want to see orange and red, okay? 74% are meeting or exceeding expectations in Newton Public Schools as 2019, right? 24% are not meeting expectations, right? If you want to, in this scenario, since there's such a low number of students that are partially meeting, we call those our bubble kids. It means they're like so close. You're so close. You're like at a 7th grade level of reading. Like you're so close. We can get you there. If you want to group them in, right, then you have 95% of your students in Newton Public Schools that are exceeding, meeting, or almost meeting expectations, right? So they've got really good data. They should be proud. Your students are doing well on the MCAS. Let's look at Lawrence Public Schools, okay? If we look at their student race and ethnicity, we see that they have a 94, almost 94% Hispanic population. And then when we look at their selected population, they have a really high population of first language, not English. If you have 35% of your grades that are English language learners in 8th grade, that's very high. That's really high. Students with disabilities is at 19%. When you look at high needs, that's almost 90%, right? And then economically disadvantaged is 79%. Those are really high numbers. What does their MCAS data show? The complete opposite. 2% of their students are exceeding expectations. That's really uncomfortable to say, right? You've got about 25% that are meeting expectations. And you've got 42% that are partially meeting, and then 31% that are not meeting. And again, the state wants to see students in the blue and the green. So the state's going to look at this and say, this isn't, what do we need to do? Do we need to, if you do this again in 2 years, right? For 2 years, then we're going to come in and take over, right? We're going to have intervention. And that's not a solution either. We also have to look at that demographics. We have to look at the data of what populations are being served in Lawrence and how is that affecting, right? So if you will, this next set of data, I would like for you to share your noticings. I'm going to give you actually the MCAS data first. And I just want you to tell me, what do you see? What do you notice? About 2 different school districts. One on the left, one on the right. Mm-hmm. So on the right, we see that there's a lot more that are not meeting expectations, right? We see a lot more red on the right graph, or on the graph on the right side, I should say. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, there's a little bit of a curve. Kind of that up and then down. So let's look at the student populations. Let's look at race and ethnicity and then those subgroups. On the left, we have a very high percentage of white students. On the right, we have a very high percentage of Hispanic students. We also have a really high percentage of those selected populations in the graph on the right. So what 2 school districts are these? This is real data that you can find on the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education profile website. This is Dover Public Schools, and this is Chelsea Public Schools. So the takeaway here is not, and I want to make this explicitly clear, the takeaway here is not that Black and Brown students or ELLs or students with disabilities are less capable and therefore not performing well on these tests, right? MCAS does not show what our students are capable of. This does not recognize children who create beautiful works of art, right? Who have beautiful singing voices, right? Children who love to cook. I had a student last year during emergency remote teaching who basically took over class and gave us a cooking class. And it was super fun and we had a great time, right? And it was amazing. So we need to celebrate our students' gifts and what they're bringing to the table and their passions, and MCAS is not showing that, right? Yeah, so I'm just looking, I see Abigail or Abby, I'm not sure what you go by, but Abigail, I can show you some math scores as well. I do have that towards the, I can pull that up at the end. But you'll give you a heads up. The data is not that much different, but I can absolutely show you some math data. I do have that. I can show you at the end. So we've got another one. We won't spend as much time because I think you're probably noticing a trend, right? On the left, you have, again, another community with a really high population of white students, right? And then on the right-hand side, you have a high population of African-American Black students. And this is Hingham Public Schools and Brockton Public Schools. So what we're seeing here is what we call the achievement gap, okay? Rethinking Schools, they're a social justice and public schools advocates. And so they wrote, the consistent use of test scores to demonstrate an achievement gap exposes the intrinsic nature of these tests. They are built to maintain inequality and not serve as an antidote to educational disparities, okay? They're not there, these tests, they're not there to help. They're really not there to help at all. So what is the achievement gap? This is the difference in educational outcomes. You just looked at a whole bunch of data on that, right? Groups that tend to experience achievement gap, racial and ethnic minorities, English language learners, students with disabilities, females, and then low socioeconomic status. Many of these groups overlap. And then standardized tests, they fail to take into consideration students' backgrounds, right? And the whole idea is to put standardized testing, behind standardized testing, is to put everyone on the exact same even playing field without taking into consideration that our students have all different lived experiences. So does anyone have any questions about anything or want me to clarify?
Actually, yeah, so this is Abigail again. So I'm not sure if we're gonna touch on this later, and please like stop me if we will, but one thing that this has me thinking about, like you mentioned, these tests, at least in Massachusetts, don't really show growth. They don't show like these intangible forms of success in students. So I went to New York public schools, so I'm sure it's different, but I remember at least in like 2013, 2014, you know, when I was in, I was towards the end of my time in those schools, they were transitioning to like they would do pre-tests in the start of the year and then post-test later to sort of show that growth rather than just doing that like 1, 2, 3, 4 evaluation scale. And I was wondering if the same is true in Massachusetts and if you think that that is a slightly better way to evaluate if there does have to be testing at all.
So just a really quick clarifying question. When you did the, like what we would call like that pre-test and post-test, was it the state of New York's educational assessment, like standardized test?
I'm pretty sure it was. I know we were doing, there was like a state transition happening, like I said, in like 2014 timeline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it would really, so a few things that I have in mind. No, that's actually really not common. We don't do that. We don't do that in Massachusetts. We didn't do that in North Carolina. And I have teacher friends that are all over the US. And so I can reach out and ask them. I have some friends that actually teach in New York as well. So I'm curious, I would be curious to know like what's behind that, because that's not normal to have students take a pre-test in the beginning of the year and then take a post-test at the end of the year to show growth. I'd be really intrigued by that. It sounds like, because I'm just thinking of the timing of like that 2013, 2014, it could have been New York's, like state of New York's way of trying to get away from that high stakes testing that we were starting to implement because of No Child Left Behind. So I'm wondering if that is something that they were taking into consideration. Could have been something piloting in, you said New York, was it New York City that you went to school in?
No, I went to school on Long Island, so it's just like the, I guess, New York State Regents curriculum at the time.
Yeah, I'll be really curious about that. I have a couple of friends, like I said, that live in New York and teach in New York, and so I kind of want to follow up and ask them. And if you'd like, I can follow up and what they say. They went, all the two friends that I'm thinking of, they went through New York public schools as children. They went through educator prep programs in the state of New York as well, and now teach there. So they should be, I'm wondering like what kind of insight they can give me on that, because that's a very unique experience. Very much so.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that, because from what you were saying earlier, I mean, I know nothing is a perfect solution, but it seems like, I mean, rather than just having these strict standards, that could be moving towards seeing growth in school districts, with different racial and socioeconomic makeups that would impede them from meeting those same standards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I will definitely reach out and ask about that, because I'm also very intrigued. Because I'm, just myself, I'm constantly looking at other ways of like, how can we not rely on this MCAS data, right? Until the state and the federal government really gets rid of it. In a way, as a teacher, I'm sort of bound by law to give the test. And so I try actually really not to rely on it, because I just know how it really is not showing a really great picture. So that would be something that I would actually really be interested in as well, hearing about. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Any other questions or things that I can clarify? Okay. So we just talked about the achievement gap, right? That really, those quite stark differences, right? And you were looking at some of the top districts and some of the kind of lower performing districts, right, in the state. So it was, the whole idea was to show you the huge gap that we do have. But I wanted to go over so what are some ways that the achievement gap can show up in our districts, in our classrooms, and within our students as well. So you have culture at the school district level, school/district level. You have culture, climate, policy, practices, right? What does the district and what does the school care about? What structures are in place? Are they being tracked, right? And this is what we talk about, like AP programs, gifted and talented programs, right? They still use IQ testing in special education testing. So you probably guess what the dominant rates for students on IEPs are. Is the school and the district, are they ignoring students' culture and backgrounds, right? Are we taking into consideration, we have a high Muslim population in Cambridge, and so are we taking into consideration that Ramadan's coming up, right? What is our curriculum focusing on? Are we only looking at texts and videos and that kind of thing that reaffirm Christian beliefs? Or are we looking at all kinds of beliefs, right? In the classroom, it can show up as having a teacher having limited beliefs about students, right? And this is why I don't actually look at MCAS scores and data for my students from the year before, because I would rather get to know them for who they are instead of making any assumptions about them based on a snapshot in time, right? Particularly that snapshot, that test score that's rooted in racial biases that could potentially end up affirming any of my implicit biases. And that's not something that I want to be a part of, right? I want to work actively against that. If you're not providing support for struggling students, right? That phrase of just try harder, that doesn't help anyone. That does not help anyone. And then we have what's called culturally responsive teaching, right? And this is the importance of including all students' culture, right? Kind of, we talked about with Ramadan coming up, that would be a culturally responsive teaching practice where students feel like they have a sense of belonging in the classroom, right? They want to see themselves represented in the classroom. Not just our Black and Brown students, but also our LGBTQ+ students, non-binary students, students who are first-generation immigrants, okay? And then within the student, some of the achievement gap examples with them are what we call stereotype threat. And we're actually going to talk through this in a moment because I find this very interesting. And, you know, experiences and social gaps, which kind of both lend itself to the internalized beliefs about limited ability and opportunity. So let's look at the stereotype threat. The American Psychological Association identifies stereotype threat as negative stereotypes that raise inhibiting doubts and high pressure anxieties in a test taker's mind. So what is it exactly, specifically, like what examples do you have? There was a study done by a few psychologists, and they found that even any kind of like passing reminder that someone belongs to one group or another, especially if that group is stereotyped as inferior in academics, that can wreak havoc with test performance. Okay, so the study that they did, they gave Black and white college students questions from the GRE, okay, and then they divided them up into 2 different groups based on their SAT scores, right? So you had both Black and white college students in one group and Black and white college students in the second group, okay? Group A was told that the test diagnosed intellectual ability, and Group B was told that it was just a problem-solving test and had absolutely nothing to do with intellectual ability. And what they found was Group A, the Black students performed less well than white students. In Group B, which was told it was problem solving and had nothing to do with ability, Black students performed equally with white students. And so these are things that are showing up in even our children, right? In these 10, 12, 14-year-old students who have been told that because of their race, you know, they're stereotyped as quote unquote inferior. And so the American Psychological Association refers to the stereotype threat in standardized testing as an endemic, right? This is a condition that is regularly found in a certain area, standardized testing, okay? When one study found that when they asked students to identify their race, Black students performed worse than white students, right? They also found that merely telling women that a math test does not show gender differences improved their testing performance. So on MCAS, on our standardized test, at the very top of their test, at the very beginning, depending if they do paper or on the computer, they have to confirm their name, their gender, their race, their date of birth, like all of these things. So even before they even read the first passage, we're already asking them to look at their identifiers. And for some, that's pushing a stereotype threat into their mind. Okay. If you look at advanced calculus test performance, this comes from the National Center for Women. When there was the level of stereotype threat was there, they performed almost as well as men. But when they removed that stereotype threat, they performed way better, right? So it's there for our children, and it's something that is affecting them, right? They're being they're distracted. They're self-conscious. They're apprehensive. They have test anxiety. There's loss of motivation, right? So all of these things are going through our young children's mind. Even as adults, you might be feeling this way. Like, this is not just a child thing, right? But as an adult, you probably maybe have some strategies or some motivators for yourself to kind of get you going that sometimes our little 8-year-olds, they don't have, right? And so basically standardized tests, they have succeeded in their original mission of figuring out an objective way to rule non-whites, women, and poor people intellectually inferior and to justify discriminating against them. Okay. So I want to make this perfectly clear. Race, ethnicity, gender, they may all correlate with gaps in achievement. It's overly simplistic. It's offensive to look at this data and assume that people of color don't have the ability to become high achievers, or that women are somehow born to be less proficient in certain areas, right? People of color, women, unhoused children and families, low socioeconomic economic status, they all can be high achieving. We as a society need to remove those barriers, which is standardized testing, that stop and test, right? We're gonna throw back to Dr. Kendi because he's so great. He's gonna talk about why what we just talked about, the achievement gap, is actually a racist idea, okay? Quote, the achievement gap between the races, with whites and Asians at the top and Blacks and Latinos at the bottom, is a racial hierarchy. And this popular racial hierarchy has been constructed by a religious faith in standardized testing. But what if, all along, our well-meaning efforts at closing the achievement gap has been opening the door to racist ideas? What if different environments actually cause different kinds of achievement rather than different levels of achievement? End quote. So, ladies, I introduced to you what we really have a problem, what the problem really is, I should say, the opportunity gap, right? The opportunity gap. This is circumstances in which people are born, their race, ethnicity, zip code, socioeconomic status, that determine their opportunities in life rather than all people having the same chance to achieve the best of their potential, okay? Children from all races, all socioeconomic statuses, they begin academic and life development in their home. Most often their funds of knowledge, right, what they bring with them to school, is not valued once they enter our public schools because that has been built around the dominant culture of white folks, right? There are two things that a person needs for reading comprehension, not just two, but two of the most important, and that's vocabulary and background knowledge, right? Those two things are what really help you to understand what you're reading. So think about it like this. If you have a child that moves from the Dominican Republic, they're 8 years old, 9 years old, they move from the Dominican Republic to Massachusetts, and they take a standardized test, and there's questions about snow. How do we know whether this child has ever personally experienced snow beyond maybe seeing it in a movie or a television show, right? If we think of our most recent winters, like, yeah, I know it's New England, we have snow, but not the last 3 years, it's been kind of not so great, right? So we assume, this, I shouldn't say we, the test assumes that students know stuff and they might not. So what are some examples of opportunity gap? 6th grade, middle class students, they have spent on average 6,000 more hours learning than children born into poverty because they attend after school and extracurricular programming that many times costs money. They attend programs in the summer, which families have to pay for. Field trips. Affluent communities can afford to send children on field trips. They are wicked expensive. Does anyone know how much it costs to rent a school bus for a day for a field trip? One school bus from like 10 a.m. to how much?
The field trips that we do for the league, when we used to book field trips, when we could go places, it was at least $600 for the trip.
Yes, it's $700 for a bus, a school bus. That doesn't include like payment to like for admission of wherever you're going and like what is food gonna cost, right? And then think about this, you know, in 7th grade, that's what I teach. 7th grade, we have 100 students, and with the number of adults to ratio that we have to have with children, we need 3 buses. $700 per times 3. I don't know. I can't do that kind of, what is it, 2,100, whatever. You get what I'm saying, right? So these affluent communities, middle-class communities, they're able to provide these things for their students, for their kids, that sometimes low-income communities can't, right? And these experiences, after school, extracurricular programming, summer learning, right, field trips, they all help build background knowledge and vocabulary. There was a question on a 3rd grade MCAS test about Claude Monet, and kids who have gone to like the MFA on a field trip, they have that background knowledge of art, right? They're going to schools that are probably well-funded and have art programs. Students from low-income communities, they don't have those same opportunities to take field trips to MFA because it costs $700 for a bus, right? And then a lot of times their art programs are usually the first to get cut because it's not a tested subject, right? So students in affluent communities, they have more experiences outside the classroom, which is going to ultimately help them in the classroom. So we have that money helps, right? We looked at these cities and towns already. We looked at Lawrence, Chelsea, Brockton, Hingham, Newton, and Dover. And again, these are sort of the extreme of the extreme. It's a little mucky in the middle. But when you look at the median household income, this comes from the Boston Globe. Lawrence was $39,627, while at the top you have Dover of $204,118. So there's this huge gap in the median household income, right? When you look at the column to the right where you have dollars per student, and there's not really all that huge of a difference. I mean, if you look at the fourth one down, you have Hingham, which is the lowest out of all three in terms of how much money they spend per student, right? What this is showing you is Title I funding, right? This is where the federal government is trying to help those lower income communities by providing Title I funding, right? And Newton and Dover, and there are many other districts that kind of fall in the middle that spend more money, spend less money, right? Dover is actually not the top when it comes to dollars spent per student. Pendry, I don't know if you know this, but Cambridge is one of the top ones. So MCAS data and scores, the discrepancy is not the same as dollars spent per student, right? When we talk about dollars spent per student, we're talking about like materials, like what kind of technology is in the classroom, what kind of, how stocked is the library, right? What kind of books are in classrooms? What textbooks are in classrooms? Do they have Chromebooks that are 5 years old, a year old? Those kinds of things. And so ultimately what you're seeing when we look at these quote unquote gaps is that it's really more based almost more on the median household income of the community, right? And standardized achievement tests, they predict parents' wealth. Does anyone have any questions or anything? I'm used to teaching middle schoolers where I have to give like 3 minutes of wait time, and I'm like, forget that adults maybe don't need that. So a professor of education at Stanford University, achievement and opportunity are intricately connected. Without opportunity, you can't really have achievement, right? And I'm going to throw it back to that bike photo. You have achievement through standardized testing, you're giving everyone the exact same thing, right? And it doesn't work. But when you have achievement through various opportunities, right? So that way scholars can demonstrate what they know and what they've learned and how they've grown. That's when we get real achievement, right? That's when we get equity. What are some challenges that families have encountered during the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm sure you've heard about many. Maybe you've experienced some yourself. Internet, yep. Yes, working parents managing their children's learning. Yes. It's a biggie, like when we're thinking about kids. Childcare. Mm-hmm. Having enough laptops, devices, lack of multiple computers for school during versus work, general stress, absolutely. Loss of jobs, right? So I know that you are well aware that this pandemic has created extra challenges, extra stressors, right, on our communities that disproportionately affect our low-income communities, right? So let's talk about MCAS specifically. President Biden, Governor Baker, among many other politicians, and the Massachusetts Commissioner of Education, Jeff Riley, they have called for standardized testing in 2021 in order to identify the gaps. The pandemic has interrupted traditional schooling, right? Buildings shut down last spring. Some communities, middle and high school students have not been in a school building in over a year. Just a personal thing, I hate it. I don't particularly care for remote learning, right? Yet they're calling for us to administer MCAS so that we, not sure who they mean by we, but so that we can see where there are gaps that the pandemic has caused, right? Make no mistake about it. When they're talking about this gap, identify the gaps, they're talking about the achievement gap is what they're talking about. Okay. So I want to talk about standards really quick. I'm trying to talk through this really quick. There's 4 of them in ELA. We're going to go over ELA only because those are what I know really well because I've taught them for 10 years, right? So you have reading, writing, language, speaking, and listening, okay? There's also math, right? Science and tech, and soon to be civics. So when you look at reading, you're talking about fiction and nonfiction, and the skills that, some of the skills as an example that we test would be inferences, textual evidence, vocabulary, or using context to understand vocabulary. In the types of writing, we have opinion or argument, informative or explanatory, narrative, which is story, and then the writing process. That's brainstorming, drafting, revising, editing, and publishing. You have language, this is grammar and vocabulary. And then you have speaking and listening, which is collaboration among students. This is discussion or discourse, presentation, public speaking, okay? So this is what the Massachusetts Common Core say that ELA, this is what our standards and teachers need to teach, okay? When we look at a 3rd grade MCAS test, out of 32 questions, total number of skills for reading is 20. They only tested 8 of those skills. In language, there's 6 skills total. They only tested 3. Same for writing. They have 6 skills total, but they only tested 3. And speaking and listening, they have 6 skills. They didn't test any of those skills. In 3rd grade, they have reading foundational skills, and this is phonics and fluency. So being able to know the difference between hat and hate, right? That magic E. They didn't test any of that. And I feel like that would actually be really important to test. I'm not a testing person, but I feel like that might actually be a thing to test. And you find the same thing in 8th grade. It doesn't get better, right? They only test 10 skills out of 20. They only test 3 out of 6 for language. They only test 3 out of 10 for writing. And again, 0 out of 6 for speaking and listening. Students are not ever tested on speaking and listening, ever. Right? So standardized testing cannot authentically evaluate or assess our students. So we are being asked to focus on teaching the standards that are tested. Is that what we're supposed to do as teachers? Or are we going to teach all the standards even if they aren't? Okay. They're calling for a scaled back version this year. So they want to cut out even more from the test. And so they really only they don't even test half of the skills in the standards. So they're going to cut out even more. We're not getting a full picture at all. We're not getting any picture. We're getting a dot on a page, right? And so why are we testing? What are we doing, right? Are standardized tests really giving us an accurate picture of our students and their knowledge of standards and skills? Okay. Bias shows up in the tests as well in terms of the questions, right? We've talked about how it's rooted in racial biases and gender bias as well, but questions show up. And so DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, they have a bias and sensitivity committee, right? And they're supposed to look for and flag anything that could be sensitive or biased to age, culture, disability, ethnicity, gender, geography, languages spoken, race, religion, sexual orientation, so socioeconomic status, right? They field test them, they make sure they work. I don't know if any of you remember this, if you had paid attention at all, but in 2019, on the 10th grade MCAS, they used the book, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I don't know a lot about this book. I've never read it, so I'm not 100% sure about it. But the MCAS test asked 10th graders to read this passage and then write a journal entry from the perspective of a white woman who was reluctant to help a runaway slave and used derogatory language to and about the runaway slave, right? And so MCAS basically asked students to put themselves in the shoes of a racist white woman, okay? And this is one that we know about. It's illegal for students to talk to teachers about questions on the MCAS, right? And when we proctor the test, we have to make it abundantly clear to students that we can't look at the test. We can't talk to students about the test. It's so secretive. I'm like, what are you hiding, right? We also have to legally sign an affidavit that, you know, when we're picking up the MCAS materials, that we will not look at the test or legal action can be taken. So I'm just wondering, like, how many other questions have been really harmful for our scholars and our students, right? DESE doesn't release every question. They don't have to. And so 10th graders knew this was wrong, right? Somebody was brave enough to speak up. But how many questions, how many passages have been included in 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade where students have been scared into keeping quiet about the test, right? Or questions that reinforce stereotypes and biases that an 8-year-old might be just too young to really pick up on. If something this overt can slip by the bias committee, how many subtle things have slipped by the bias committee, right? So not only is it rooted, there's also biases that are showing up in the actual test that can, you know, if you don't say anything, can reaffirm things that a lot of people are trying to actively work to undo. They're implicit biases, right? So some alternatives, or before we get there, in case nothing else made you mad, maybe this will. A report released in 2012 found that states were spending up to $669 million to administer standardized tests. This is across the board, across the US. This is not just one state that spends that much money, dear God. In Massachusetts, we spend $64 per student on a standardized test. The national average is $27 per student. So that's your taxpayer dollars at work, y'all. You know? All right, alternatives. And this is something that I'm definitely going to follow up with, also not on the list that Abigail talked about, but we have portfolio-based assessments, right? And so this is a collection of work over time. This focuses on progress and growth. We ask scholars to reflect on their learning, right? We do portfolios at my school and they're like absolutely beautiful. People from all over the district come to attend. Kids are extremely honest when they're reflecting about themselves, like sometimes a little too honest, right? They'll be like, yeah, I was up all night playing Fortnite and that's why I didn't do it. Oh, okay. But then we can have authentic conversations about like, okay, so let's talk about time management, right? Let's talk about maybe like prioritizing some stuff, okay? It's equitable because students are able to showcase pieces of work that they're capable of doing. If they're a poet, they should be showing their poetry. We have this thing called stealth assessments, and it's a passive way to collect data, and students have no idea that's what we're doing. And so it kind of alleviates both cost and anxiety of like that stop and test of MCAS. There's so many programs out there where they like kids actually kind of enjoy them. There's like games, right? But they're standards-based programs that I clearly forgot to finish that sentence there. They're standards-based in the sense that they look at grammar, right? They look at vocabulary, they look at figurative language, they have students read passages, they have kids write, and kids just think that they're practicing. They don't realize that we're actually using it for assessing on how well that they're meeting the standards. We have standards-based grading, which is my personal favorite. And this is where we measure students on the proficiency of standards, and we get rid of that 0 to 100%, that A+, D- grade level grading, right? And so what we do when we give an assignment, right, or we give a project, and we look at what standards is this assignment meeting? Are we having them make inferences in the text? And then are we having them use textual evidence? And what we do is we use kind of the same scale of 1 through 4 of like exceeding, right, meeting, almost meeting, and not meeting, right? And it gets rid of the, like I said, the 0 to 100%, which really doesn't show you anything other than did the kid complete it or not, right? Did they complete it well, right? And then you start getting into these like really arbitrary arguments about like late work, right? A kid turns in a presentation and it's beautiful and it meets all the standards and it's awesome, but it was a week late, and so now I got to take points off, and so they get a B instead of an A. That doesn't work. Standards-based grading has teachers and students look at the work, look at the standards, and evaluate together. Are you meeting it? Where do we need to go? Where's there room for growth? So on and so forth. Okay. It helps us to identify those who may need support. It gives meaning to grades, right? And it allows for us to differentiate instruction. So what are you interested in? What are you interested in, right? Instead of us all doing the exact same thing. What can you do? If you have a child, I'm not sure if you do or not. I do not, but hey, I know some people on this call don't. So if you have a child, talk to the teacher, right? And see if there's any way that you can support them. I don't know very many teachers that are into standardized testing. And that's not just a Boston area or a Massachusetts thing. I'm talking about throughout the United States. There are not very many teachers. The number of teachers that oppose standardized testing is greater than the teachers that like it. If you have a school-aged family member, like a niece or a cousin, maybe try to talk to the parent and see if there's a way that, you can get them to talk to the child's teacher. But there is nothing stronger than a teacher-parent relationship. If parents and teachers are on the same page, they can literally change anything. There is an MCAS movement right now. It's from Citizens for Public Schools. It's a Boston-based education reform organization, and they have this opt out of MCAS call right now. DESE refers to this as test refusal, but there's no consequences for students. If a parent sends a letter that says, I do not want my child to take the MCAS, there's no consequence for the student. In normal times, there is for school districts, but not this year. There's not. Get in touch with your representative, right? If we can get legislation, get going through the House, right? Get going through the Senate, and make permanent change, not just for 2021 at the end of a pandemic, that would be amazing, and just, really, really cut back on a lot of stress and anxiety that our scholars face. And then finally, every city, town has a school committee or a board of education. Anyone can speak at your local school committee. Tonight was Boston's, last night was Cambridge. You can sign up. If you live there, then you are allowed to speak at the school committee. And so you can show up even if you don't have a kid. It does not matter. You don't have to be a parent, right? You live there, you invest in that community, right? You, I'm assuming, want what's best for children. School committee represents you because you voted for them, so you need to speak out. And then there are just a list of school committees as of yesterday that had a suspend MCAS resolution. In Cambridge, we did pass ours. It's not enough, but it's happening. And I think Boston was talking about theirs tonight too. So I'm going to leave you with a final quote from a student of mine who was writing about her experience in 4th grade taking MCAS. I asked her if this was okay, and she said yes. She wrote, "I remember dreading the MCAS. Me and my friends were super scared for the MCAS. I remember shutting myself in my room and never really wanting to go to school. I was super stressed, and I barely ever enjoyed anything because of the MCAS." This is a 4th grader, right? And that's so sad. It's really upsetting that this is what we're putting our 4th graders through, our 9-year-old and 10-year-olds. Are there any questions at all? Pendry, yeah, I still have some portfolios too that I look back at it's interesting and embarrassing. Yeah.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
So those of us in the corporate world, I'm sure hear the phrase, if you can't measure it, you can't move it or change it, or some variation of that theme. What's the thought around that in this context?
If you can't move it, you can't change it.
You can't measure it.
Measure it, you can't change it. Truthfully, I'm not really sure because we don't have that phrase.
Interesting.
Yeah. Like we don't say if you can't measure it, you can't move it. I think when it comes to like, if you want to talk about like measuring student success or like measuring student achievement, there are so many other ways that teachers do it regularly. We don't need MCAS to tell us how our students are performing. If you were to ask me, if you gave me a list of all 100 students and I said, I need a detailed report on how they're meeting each standard, I can write it if you give me the time, right? We are well aware. We have these informal assessments where we ask scholars to reflect on their learning, right? And we can use that. We do have formal assessments where we give quizzes, right? When we're talking maybe about vocabulary, we will give quizzes, right? Those are pretty low stakes kind of thing. We have students create presentations. It just kind of depends on what the standard is. We have reading assessments. There are professional reading assessments that we use to kind of track students, especially over the years. We'll have them start in elementary. Scholastic has one. In Cambridge, we use FastBridge. They're not really standardized testing in what we talked about here, although they do kind of get a little murky. So you don't want to rely completely on that. So there's other ways that teachers are assessing our students throughout the year and over the year. We don't need MCAS to tell us anything because it's literally 1 day, 2 days technically in time that we don't even get data for 6 months. So does that answer it? Like we're still assessing students. We just don't need these high stakes testing.
No, I totally get that. And I do not doubt for a minute that teachers and at a school level know exactly what's going on, but at a state or national level, what's the benefit of having some, like, how would you devise a better way to benchmark or measure what's happening?
So that's a good question. So there's two things that I'm thinking of. Which one do I want to go with first? We'll talk about the national report card. So most organizations and most, education folks will talk about the test that students will take called the national report card. And it's a test, it's a reading test and a math test that they get, I know in 8th grade and I think in 5th grade. It's not every 8th grader or every 8th grader in the US. It doesn't happen at every school district. In the years that I've worked in Cambridge, they were selected once for the 8th grade to take it. So it's a snapshot, right, that they take from like the Northeast, urban areas, rural areas, the Midwest, the South, to kind of just use sampling to get a whole picture. And so most people would say that they don't necessarily, teachers don't really care. Like, you can keep that, right? If you want us to give a standardized test, even though it's rooted in some racial biases, right? And so maybe we need to work through that. But having that national report card test, that's something that is still accepted as, like, we could use this as something for the national level. At the state level, and it would be accepted by the state as well. At the state level, so the state accepts portfolios in lieu of MCAS for some of our students or some of our students with disabilities. So our students who are autistic students, they do not take the version of standardized testing that I presented to you today, where it's multiple choice with essays. They actually do portfolios. So the state's willing to make an accommodation for them, and they absolutely should, because the students with autism that are using the portfolio system for MCAS, they are usually on the severe side of the autism spectrum. And so the state accepts it for them. I don't see why we can't do that for every student, right? They do it for the kids with autism, rightfully so, and they should. So I don't want to like negate that, but we could do it for all students as well. Like there's already a program in place for that. I don't see why we can't expand it to include all states. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yes. So Shannon asked, do you think that ACT and SAT for college admission is just as biased, or is it more specific to these achievement style tests? They are just as biased. The ACT, or the SAT, I should say, was created by Carl Brigham. He is the father of the SAT, and he is that enthusiastic eugenicist that we talked about at the beginning. And so they are absolutely probably maybe even more biased than these K through 12 standardized tests. If you look at, I don't have any data to show you, but if you look at the data of who goes to college and who passes those tests, you're going to see very similar data to what you see in MCAS. So yeah, it's just as biased, maybe possibly even more. Are there any other questions or comments? I know I said I could show you some math data, and I can. I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and I will show you, if you are interested in seeing that I can show you some math data. I just use ELA because that's what I'm familiar with. Let me just find it. Okay, I'll show you. This is grade. So this is grade 3 in Newton for both English, language arts, and math. So you'll see it's pretty similar across the board. So that's grade 3, comparing both English and math. I'll show you another one for grade 8. Again, pretty similar. Most people don't know that the math test is kind of a reading test. They don't really give just like what's 2 + 2 anymore, or like what's 10 × 10, or solve for y, or anything like that. They give these whole reading prompts really in order to solve a math problem. So that's Newton. This is Lawrence Public Schools for 3rd grade, both ELA on the left and math. Is grade 8 for ELA and math. So it looks like they do better in math, which is good. What else do I have? This is Dover, I believe. Yeah, this is Dover. So this is a combo. This is all an average for grades 3 through 8 in English language arts on the left, and grades 3 through 8 in math. So it's not a set grade level. It's just kind of a whole look at all the grade levels. And then I have Chelsea. Right? Yeah. That's grades 3 through 8. This is Hingham. This is Brockton.
Extremely similar.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
Wow, this was extremely eye-opening. As someone that did not go through the Massachusetts public school system and does not have children, these are things that I really didn't know. So I'm sure other people feel the same way. We're at 8:00. If anybody has any last lingering questions, speak now. Connie, that was so great. I really appreciate all your time and your talent and walking us through what you experience and what our students experience, and also the girls that we serve as well.
Yeah.
Really learned a lot. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad I could share. I feel like I talk about this stuff with fellow educators and we all know already. And I'm like, I feel like we need to tell other people. We all know this.
Yes, this is all stuff I really did not know about. So I appreciate learning.
Awesome, Elizabeth. Yay, we have a fellow educator. Yay.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining tonight and being with me.
It was fun. It was great.
Awesome. Where do you teach, if you don't mind me asking?
I teach, so I'm in an independent school, so it definitely is a very, very different experience. And I teach pre-K, so, but I went to BU for my master's in elementary education. Gotcha. And then BC for a second master's in reading and literacy. So a lot of this has been like, even though it's not on my day-to-day radar, like percolating in my mind, and it's always a great touch point, to like get myself back in what's going on everywhere else.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining. I'm glad it was good for you. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll sign off. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Connie.
Thank you.
Awesome. I can't wait for the follow-up of standardized tests have been canceled. What now?
What now?
How do we measure them? Pendry can come up with a solution.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Threw me with that one.
It's a thing that people say, and it's like we have to measure everything. It's like, okay, I kind of get it, but at the same time, maybe don't do it in a racist way.
Right, exactly. I think that's kind of the biggest problem is like we don't like, okay, like I'll like assess students. I'm not against assessing students and seeing where they're at, but this like 1 day snapshot in time or 2 day snapshot in time is just, it tells me nothing.
That like stealth,
yeah,
that like I feel like it's like if you could come up with like a game like the Oregon Trail culturally sensitive version, or like for specific languages that people speak, cultures that they come from, and you just